All right, so in this video, what I'll do is I'll quickly go through how to do the 10 trig identities that I gave you in class. All right, so let's start with number one. Okay, first thing I saw some people doing as I was walking around is they tried changing everything to sines and cosines, but because you have secant plus tangent times secant minus tangent, those are conjugates, I would always multiply out conjugates first. So that's going to be secant squared theta, and then secant times negative tangent, and secant times positive tangent. Okay, those will cancel out. And then lastly, I have positive tangent times negative tangent. That's negative tangent squared. And now if you go back and look at your Pythagorean identities, secant squared minus tangent squared is a Pythagorean identity, and it's equal to 1, okay, which is exactly what's on the right-hand side. Okay, in the second problem, what I would do here is distribute this out. So you have cosine squared theta plus cosine squared theta times tangent squared theta. Okay. Now what I would do is change tangent squared to sines and cosines. So cosine squared theta plus, I'm going to make cosine squared over 1. I'm going to make tangent sine squared over cosine squared. This is an example of using a quotient identity with a higher power. Because I have multiplication right there, the cosines cancel out. I end up with cosine squared plus sine squared, and that is our first Pythagorean identity. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1, and that's what they wanted me to get. Okay, number 3, I have secant minus tangent. First, I would change everything to sines and cosines. So 1 over cosine minus sine over cosine. And by doing that, you automatically ended up with a common denominator of cosine. So we can write it all together like this. And now from here, this is example 5 in the notes from yesterday. I have 1 minus sine over cosine. My goal is to get cosine over 1 plus sine. So what I'm going to do in the next step is multiply top and bottom by the conjugate. Okay, when we do it in the top, we get 1 times 1, 1 times positive sine, 1 times negative sine. That's going to cancel. Negative sine times positive sine is negative sine squared. Okay. Leave the bottom. Don't multiply anything out. And you'll see why in the next step. So cosine times 1 plus sine. Now in the top, I have 1 minus sine squared. That's a Pythagorean identity. If you look back from yesterday, 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. So I have cosine squared in the top, and cosine times 1 plus sine in the bottom. Now the top has 2 cosines and the bottom has 1. So I can cancel 1 from here and 1 from there. So I'm left with cosine over 1 plus sine, okay, which again is what I was supposed to get. All right, number 4. That one, let's see. So we have tangent plus cotangent. Okay, let's start by finding changing everything to sines and cosines. So tangent becomes sine over cosine. Cotangent is cosine over sine. And now I'm going to add these together and find a common denominator. The common denominator is the product of the 2 that I have. Cosine times sine. This denominator is missing the sine, so I'll multiply it on the top and bottom. The denominator on the right is missing the cosine. Okay, so on the left, I get sine times sine, which is sine squared. On the right, I get cosine times cosine, which is cosine squared. Again, this is, I think, the third time this Pythagorean identity has popped up. Sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. All right, so now think of it like this. We have 1 over cosine and 1 over sine. Okay. What's 1 over cosine? That's secant. And what's 1 divided by sine? Cosecant. And that is what they were looking for. Okay, number 5. We've got secant minus cosine. All right, I'm going to try the same approach here. I'm going to first change everything to sines and cosines. So I have 1 over cosine minus cosine over 1. Next step, I'll find a common denominator, which is the product of those two. So it's going to be cosine. The fraction on the left already has the common denominator, so I don't need to change it. The fraction on the right is missing cosine. Okay, so I'll multiply top and bottom by cosine. That's going to give me 1 minus cosine squared in the top and cosine in the bottom. This is again Pythagorean identity number 1. 1 minus cosine squared, sine squared over cosine. Okay, and as I walked around today, the trick I gave people here is, what does sine squared mean? It means to do sine times sine. And what's still left in the bottom? I still have my cosine in the bottom. Now, look at what I just wrote right here. Sine divided by cosine. Sine divided by cosine, that's a quotient identity, that's tangent. And I'm still left with the sine in front, which is what they were looking for right there. Okay, number 6. This one, when you start to do it out, it's a little tricky, but especially because of this minus sign. All right, so let's go through it. Again, everything's already sines and cosines, so my first step would be find a common denominator, which is going to be that times that. So I'm going to have sine times cosine, and I need to change both denominators. I'm going to multiply this by cosine, and that by cosine. And we're going to multiply this one by sine, and sine. Now, when we do this out, what we have to be careful of, that's going to get distributed like that. That's going to get distributed like that. But we also have this minus that's in front of the set of parentheses. So that minus also gets distributed. So basically, in the second set of parentheses, it's like you're distributing a minus with the sign, like a minus sign. So as I do this out, I get cosine times sine, and then I get cosine times cosine, and then in the next part, I'm going to distribute this as a negative sign, okay? So I'm distributing the negative and the sign at the same time. So I get minus cosine sine. There's my minus, there's my sine, and I multiplied it by the cosine right there. All right. And next, we've got sine times, or I'm sorry, that's a negative sign times a negative sign, because I'm distributing that negative with that sign. So that's negative sine times negative sine, which is plus sine squared. Now, we've got a cosine times sine, that's positive, and we have a cosine times sine, that's negative. So in the top, I'm left with cosine squared plus sine squared. And in the bottom, sine times cosine. Okay, the top is our first Pythagorean identity. Cosine squared plus sine squared turns into 1. And in the bottom, we have sine times cosine. Okay, and in an earlier problem, we saw this kind of thing where we have 1 over sine, which is cosecant, and then 1 over cosine is secant. And that's what they were looking for. We have it as cosecant times secant, but that's the same thing as secant times cosecant. Okay, number 7. In this one, what I would do is, let's change the first part to sines and cosines. So we get secant is 1 over cosine. Cosecant is 1 over sine. And now the second part, sine over cosine, I would rewrite that as tangent. And the reason I'm writing it as tangent is because I see tangent in the final answer. So if I can introduce tangent as I'm doing the problem, that's probably going to lead me in the right direction because it's in the final answer. Now here, okay, you have a fraction divided by a fraction. So keep what's in the top the same and multiply by the reciprocal of what's in the bottom. Okay, combine those together. 1 times sine is sine. And then cosine times 1 is cosine. And now we have the same fraction right here that we started with earlier. Sine over cosine is tangent plus another tangent gives me 2 tangent. Okay, example 8. There's a couple different ways you can do this one. I saw some people finding a common denominator. And then I also saw some people try the conjugate. The conjugate actually works out a little bit nicer. So if you just leave the 1 the same. That's going to stay the same for the whole problem. Take this fraction and multiply top and bottom by 1 minus sine. Okay, and watch what happens here. So we have 1 minus. Okay, in the top, I'm just going to leave cosine squared times 1 minus sine. In the bottom, I'm going to FOIL it out. 1 times 1. 1 times negative sine is negative sine. 1 times positive sine is positive sine. Those cancel. And then I have a positive sine times a negative sine. That's negative sine squared. Now, keep the top the same. And look at what's in the bottom. 1 minus sine squared. Okay? 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. So now, because that's multiplication, you can cancel those out. So we have 1 minus, and leave that 1 minus sign in parentheses. Now distribute out your minus sign. And you get 1 minus 1, and then minus times minus sign is plus sign. 1 minus 1 cancels. And you're left with just sign. Okay, number 9. Let's take a look. So on this one, I would distribute this out. So we have cosine squared times 1 is just cosine squared, plus cosine squared times tangent squared. Now change tangent squared to sines and cosines. Cosine squared plus cosine squared. And I'm just going to give that a denominator of 1. And tangent squared is sine squared over cosine squared. Now, because that's multiplication, I can cancel my numerator and my denominator, that's cosine squared. And I'm left with cosine squared plus sine squared, which is an identity we've seen at least 5 or 6 times now. Cosine squared plus sine squared gives me 1. Okay, and last problem. Okay, this is one where you just want to change everything to sines and cosines. So tangent squared is sine squared over cosine squared times cosine squared, and I'm going to make that over 1. Cotangent squared is cosine squared over sine squared. And I'm going to multiply that by sine squared over 1. Now, because this is multiplication, I can cancel that and that. This is multiplication, so I can cancel that and that. So I'm left with sine squared plus, just copying down my plus sign, cosine squared. Okay, and sine squared plus cosine squared, by now you should know what that one is. Gives me 1, and that's what they wanted me to get. Okay, so hopefully you found that review helpful to at least see the answers and how to do the problems. If not, we can go through some of these problems again tomorrow before the test. Okay, remember that there's area of a triangle, so you need to know the formula that's 1/2 the product of the two sides times the sine of the angle between them, and you need to know Heron's formula. Okay, so there'll be 8 questions on area of a triangle, and then the rest of the test will be multiple choice identities.